There was a time long ago, the Great Spirit, he had 2 sons. And one day he called in his 2 sons, and he said, "My sons, it is my desire that you should both go down and be born upon the earth, and live there for a time as men." And so it was, these 2 sons of the Great Spirit came and were born here upon the earth. And when they grew up, both of them became chiefs of their people. Now the first one had come to be known by his nation as the Fat Chief. And the Fat Chief was a man who was very much loved and honored and respected by his people. And this is because he was a very good leader. He took very good care of his people. He always made sure the people had good places to camp, where there was plenty of grass for the horses, plenty of good fresh water to drink, and plenty of game for the men to hunt, so they could feed their families. The Fat Chief himself, he had many horses, and if you were to see them, these were beautiful animals. They always had very nice, sleek, shiny coats. And if you were to see the lodge where he lived, his teepee always had a beautiful white cover. Everything was very neat and very clean. The Fat Chief had a wife, and his wife was a woman who was always very jolly. She would always greet visitors when they came to their home and make sure that they had something to eat and something to drink. And the Fat Chief himself would often spend many hours talking to the children. He would sometimes tell them funny stories to help them smile and laugh. One day, the Fat Chief was getting ready to have some supper, and it was a beautiful day outdoors, and so he had decided that he was going to have his supper outside in front of his lodge. His wife had prepared a wonderful meal and brought him a plate of food, and he was sitting there just getting ready to have a bite to eat, when all of a sudden there came a strange sound from out of the brush. And when the Fat Chief looked over where that sound was coming from, here coming towards him from out of the brush was a young woman, and she was holding the hands of 2 little small children, and all 3 of them were crying because they were hungry. You see, this young mother had just recently lost her husband in battle, and she had no one to provide for her and her children. So the Fat Chief called over to her, and he said, "Sister, here, come over here. Come and bring your children. Come and sit down and have something to eat." So the Fat Chief brought over this young woman and had her sit down with her children, and he wiped their tears, and he fed them all some supper till they were no longer hungry. And after they had had plenty to eat, then the Fat Chief took the 2 little children and sat them in his lap, and he began to tell them some funny stories. And soon they were all smiling and laughing, and in a short while they went on their way. Now a short time later, the Fat Chief was getting ready to have another bite of his supper, when all of a sudden there came another sound from out of the brush. When he looked to where that sound was coming from, here coming towards him was an elderly grandma lady, and the grandma was crying because she too was hungry. You see, she had lost her husband many years before, and she was all alone. So the Fat Chief called to her, and he said, "Grandma, Grandma, come over. Come and sit down. Come and have something to eat." So he did the same for the grandma lady, and he fed her some supper till she was no longer hungry, and soon she went on her way. Now the day finally arrived that it was time for the Fat Chief to go back home and be with the Great Spirit. And as he was there lying inside of his teepee, lying there on his deathbed, waiting to go home, all of a sudden here came all of the people. The whole nation was coming to his lodge to mourn for him. And as the people were coming, they were all crying and lifting their voices to the Great Spirit. And they were saying, "O Great Spirit, please do not take our Fat Chief away from us. If you take our Fat Chief from us, Who's going to look after us? Who's going to make sure that we have plenty to eat? Who will talk to our children? Please take one of us instead, but do not take our fat chief away from us. Now, if you'll recall at the beginning of my story, I mentioned there were two sons of the Great Spirit, and that both of them had grown up to become chiefs of their people. The second one had come to be known by his tribe as the Skinny Chief. Now, the Skinny Chief was a man who lived his life much differently than his brother. You see, the Skinny Chief, he only had one horse. And this poor horse was a very sad-looking animal. He was real skinny, and you could see his ribs sometimes poking out through his skin like that. The Skinny Chief, if you were to see his lodge, it always kind of looked sort of dingy and dirty looking. Everything was real messy and cluttered inside. And the Skinny Chief had a wife, but his wife was a woman who was always very shy and very quiet. She never smiled, and she hardly ever spoke to anyone. One day the Skinny Chief was preparing to have his evening meal, and his wife had prepared some food and brought him a plate, and he was sitting out in front of his lodge, just getting ready to have a bite to eat, when all of a sudden there came a strange sound from out of the brush straight out in front of him. And when the Skinny Chief looked to where that sound was coming from, here coming towards him from out of the brush was a real scrawny-looking dog. Now, this poor dog was a very pitiful-looking creature. He had sores all over his body. He was real skinny because he was starving, and you could see his ribs poking out through his skin. The poor dog had his tail all tucked between his legs, and very timidly he came creeping up to where the Skinny Chief was eating, to see if perhaps he could beg for something to eat. But as the dog came closer, all of a sudden the Skinny Chief reached down and he picked up a stick that was lying there on the ground. And he beat the dog with the stick, and he chased him away. He said, "Go on, get away from here. Don't bother me." Now the day finally arrived that it was time for the Skinny Chief, too, to go home and be with the Great Spirit. And there he was, lying inside of his lodge on his deathbed, waiting to go home. And no one came to mourn for him. There was no one there except for his wife. She was the only one. And as the Skinny Chief lay there on one side of the lodge, his wife, she sat all the way over on the other side of the teepee, just sitting there quietly back in the shadows, waiting for her husband to die. And as she sat there, this woman, she had one little small tear that slowly rolled down her cheek. But over on the other side of her face, she had just a little bit of a smile, because she knew that soon she was going to be free. Now, with these thoughts in mind, I would like for you to take this story and share it with your family and your friends, your neighbors and your relatives. And ask yourself this question: when the day finally comes that it is your time to go home and be with the Great Spirit yourself, how would you have all of the people who know you to think of you and the time that you had spent walking here on this earth? Would all of those people think of you in the same manner as they would think of the fat chief or the Skinny Chief?